Welcome to Far Tours. Today we'll be taking you all across the world to show you the many different versions of one of Disney's most iconic rides, Pirates of the Caribbean. On top of just being a very good attraction, this ride holds a lot of significance to both Disney and theme park history. It was one of the last attractions Walt Disney himself had a hand in making, with the ride coming out only 3 months after his passing. On top of this, Disney would later adapt the ride into a movie in the early 2000s to a pretty massive success. The movie would later get many sequels, gathering a pretty large amount of fans. But none of this would have been possible without that original attraction opening at Disneyland in 1967. The ride starts with you entering your boat before being taken into a swamp-like area which houses the restaurant that is actually inside the attraction. The restaurant area itself looks very nice, but since I've never been there, I can't really speak on the food's quality. But if you're eating here, it's probably more for the novelty of it being inside of a ride. So after exiting that area, we come upon a pirate skull giving you classic pirate advice such as keeping your arms and legs inside the vehicle. This then leads into the ride's big drop into a really pretty aquatic cavern. We then see a bunch of depictions of different skeletons who seemingly died while doing pirate activities. This part of the ride lasts for a while and explains to the rider that the pirates seem to be looking for some kind of cursed treasure. Then the ride opens up into a much larger scene of some pirates attacking a town before the rest of the ride where we just see them causing general havoc. This ride's theming is absolutely top notch, and for how long the ride is, you see so many extremely detailed scenes that all tell their own stories and really build up this ride as its whole own world. Now obviously, since this ride is a little old, as in it was made before my parents were conceived, some changes have been made since the original opening day ride. Obviously the ride goes through refurbishments every so often to make sure everything is still working well and functioning properly, but some bigger changes have been made to some of the scenes, especially in the later half of the ride. Since the ride would go on to spawn a very successful film franchise, it was decided to incorporate some of the characters from the movie into the ride. Most notably, we have a lot of characters now mentioning Jack Sparrow, along with Jack making a few new appearances along the way. Another big change made was the removal of the bride auction scene, which made a lot of news headlines a few years back. In all reality, this change made a difference that really wasn't that noticeable, and I doubt really affected that many people's enjoyment of the ride. Despite the changes made, everything that makes this ride special is still here, but now we just have a little more Johnny Depp and a little less auctioning of women. Now moving over to Disney World in Florida, we have a more interesting situation when it comes to that version of the Pirates ride. By the time Disney World opened, Pirates had already become a fan favorite attraction at Disneyland, so guests were a little disappointed on opening day when there was no pirates to be seen. You see, Disney World was originally never going to get a Pirates of the Caribbean ride. There was going to be a ride called Western River Expedition that would basically have taken its place at the park. But since there was a fairly large demand for the ride, it was quickly added to the plans. The creation of Western River Expedition was not cancelled because of Pirates of the Caribbean, but it left them without the proper budget to make the ride, which led them to put it off for a while. Eventually, the ride would basically be replaced by Big Thunder Mountain, which in my opinion was probably for the best. The ride was supposed to be a replacement for Pirates at the park, so having both of them would have felt pretty redundant. But back at the main topic at hand, the version of Pirates at Disney World is very similar to the one in Disneyland, but because the ride was made a little quicker without it in the original plans, the ride scenes are much smaller, and the overall ride is significantly shorter than the original. There is no swamp area present in this version of the ride. When you embark in your boats, you are put immediately into the cave from the original. This part specifically is way shorter than it is in the original, and since the ride starts in the cave, the drop no longer takes place in its entrance. The drop is now in the transition from the cave into the battle scene, then we get taken into the village scene, which takes up most of the ride, and it is basically just a smaller scale version of the originals. We have the auction scene here as well, which underwent the same changes as the original, as well as Johnny Depp sneaking his way in here. While maybe not as good as the original ride was, this version still offers a very similar experience and is still fun to ride. I do think that it is a little sad that another ride basically got scrapped because of this one, but it was probably a wise decision to include the ride in the park considering how popular it is. So the next version of the ride opened in Tokyo Disneyland. From what I can tell, this version doesn't have as much of a history as the first two, because by the time Tokyo Disneyland opened, there was probably no question on whether or not they would put pirates in the park. This ride is basically a mashup of the Disneyland and Disney World versions, with some scenes resembling Disneyland more, and some resembling Disney World more. While the ride did get updated to be more like the movies and include a lot of those characters, a lot of the other changes made to the ride in America never made it to this version of the ride. I've seen many people online say that this ride almost acts as a time capsule for a lot of the things that were in the original ride. One of the main things that stayed was the original version of the auction scene that we have mentioned a few times, but I have also heard that smaller things like the lighting are more in line with the original version of the ride than even the newer versions of the original ride. Compared to the other versions we have talked about so far, I think that this may be the best out of the three. It combines the things that worked in both previous versions, while also acting as a way to preserve some of the original ride elements that are no longer present in the American parks. Also, the restaurant returns in this one, and I think that's cool. After Tokyo Disneyland, the next big park to open would be Euro Disneyland, now called Disneyland Paris. This park would of course get its own version of Pirates of the Caribbean, but I would say that this was the first one to deviate quite a bit from the original ride. Instead of starting off in a swamp or right in the cave, you start off in this tropical area which houses the ride's restaurant. Then the ride takes you through multiple scenes of shipwrecks that then lead you into this flooded town that also has a lot of really cool set pieces before going into the ride's first drop. After this, the ride is a lot like the other three we have talked about, with all of the usual set pieces we know and love. After going through the usual pirate scenes, we head into the ride's second drop, which then leads us to the cave that is usually at the beginning of the ride, acting as the ride's final scene, which is a cool twist on the ride. I really like this version because it is able to be its own thing and introduce new ideas while still being faithful to the original ride. All of the new scenes added look really nice, and I think that the tropical scene at the beginning definitely fits the pirate theme a little more. Like all of the others, this one was updated with more movie characters and set pieces along with other things like the updated auction scene. This is definitely a version I would love to ride someday, but we still have one more to go through, and this one might be the most different out of all of them. In Shanghai Disneyland, we have the first ride to not just be named Pirates of the Caribbean. This one is called Pirates of the Caribbean Battle for the Sunken Treasure. Now, unlike the rest of these rides where they were made before the movies were and just updated after they were made, this ride uses the movies basically as the basis for the plot of the ride. The ride starts off with you traveling through a ruined town which houses the restaurant. I swear, every version of the ride has a restaurant except the one I've ridden. After making your way through this scene, we enter a cave with many different scenes of some very bony pirates. We even see a recreation of the classic dog key scene, except they are all skeletons, which is funny to think that the dog sat there and taunted them until its final days. But then we see one of the skeletons transform into Johnny Depp, who is now fluent in Chinese. All jokes aside though, it is a pretty cool looking scene. After this, the boat is magically transported under the water, where we see a lot more screens than you usually would on the other rides we have talked about. These scenes look absolutely gorgeous, and when they start blending them together with real set pieces and animatronics, it looks amazing. We then continue through some of the most beautiful scenes I have ever seen in a theme park attraction before running into one of Davy Jones' henchmen and then into the man himself, with the only words he is speaking that I understand being Jack Sparrow. We then enter another screen room where we and a bunch of sunken ships are lifted back up to the surface and right into the middle of a giant ship battle. We then enter one of the sinking ships where Jack Sparrow and Davy Jones are having a battle before being thrusted into a backwards drop, which is really cool, especially since you can't see it coming. I almost forgot to mention that unlike the other 4 rides in this video, these are not just normal boats. They use some kind of invisible track which allows the ride to have better immersion, along with being able to rotate as much as the ride designers want. After the drop, we enter the final scene where we see Jack Sparrow singing A Pirate's Life for Me before going back to the station and exiting the ride. This is truly one of the most impressive and beautiful theme park rides I think I have ever seen. The ride is able to use all of these new concepts and characters introduced in the movies while still creating its own original story that takes you through some absolutely beautiful set pieces. Also, the ride uses a lot of music from the movies, and the music from those movies is great, and I genuinely think it adds to the ride experience. This is by far the best version of the ride, and I hope someday one of the parks closer to me could get a ride like it. Today we got to see some amazing rides, from some old classics to some groundbreaking new ones. We got to see how one of Walt Disney's final projects would end up going on to becoming a beloved franchise of rides and movies that are loved by millions of people. It was amazing to get to see the evolution of these rides and how they were constantly trying to improve the set pieces and stories. But I hope you will join us for our next tour, where we will be heading to New Orleans.